You're listening to the Corbett Report.
Welcome back, friends. Welcome back to the Corbett Report. I'm your host, James Corbett of CorbettReport.com, coming to you, as always, from the sunny climes of Western Japan, here in September of 2024, with episode 465 of the Corbett Report podcast, the UN's Death Pact for the Globalist Future. All right. I am sure that the more clued-in, switched-on listeners of the Corbett Report will probably already know what that title is in reference to, but if not, don't worry, we're going to make sure everybody is on board and understands about the Summit of the Future that is about to take place in New York and what it means for you. And in order to do so, well, why don't we just consult some of the many times that I've been ringing the alarm bell about this for the past, well, documentably 2.5 years, going all the way back to April of 2022, and I hope you will remember, here's what's next on the Globalist calendar, my newsletter editorial in which I talked about the Summit of the Future, which at that time was scheduled for September of 2023. Well, that was delayed to September of 2024, but here we are. You'll hopefully also remember my conversation with Jakob Nordengard last June in 2023, where we talked about the Our Common Agenda policy briefing documents that are informing this Summit of the Future. And that was an interesting conversation, lots of interesting topics there, so hopefully you've seen that. And also, hopefully you've seen my recent Solutions Watch from July of this year on Our Summit for Our Future, where I talked to Dan Aston Gregory about the People's Reset response to the UN Summit of the Future. But if you didn't catch all of that, here is your chance to catch up on it. Obviously, the links to all of these reports will be in the show notes for today's edition of the Corbett Report podcast, so please go to CorbettReport.com and follow the links to these various interviews and reports. I think they're important, but let's just bring everyone on board with this Here's What's Next on the Globalist Calendar 2022 write-up, where I noted that last September, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres launched an 85-page report entitled Our Common Agenda. According to a write-up from Democracy International, the report offers a roadmap for upgrading the UN and calls for reinvigorated multilateralism, easy for me to say, renewed solidarity, and stronger consideration of future generations. But as I also noted later on, where did I note that? Here. I said, embedded in this paean to global government is another idea, the convening of a Summit of the Future in conjunction with the meeting of the UN General Assembly in New York in September 2023. As I say, that got postponed because the gaggle of globalists did not have their ducks all in a row for the 2023 General Assembly. Here we are in 2024, and it is on, like Donkey Kong, as the kids say, and you don't have to take my word for that. You can go straight to the horse's mouth, in this case, un.org, which has a handy-dandy explainer page about what is the Summit of the Future. Indeed, what is the Summit of the Future? Tell us, UN. The Summit is a high-level event bringing world misleaders together to forge a new international consensus. I'm not part of this consensus. I don't know who is. On how who's we, deliver a better present and safeguard the future. Deliver a better present. Wow, okay. Effective global cooperation is increasingly critical to our survival, but difficult to achieve in an atmosphere of mistrust. How dare you mistrust your misleaders? Using outdated structures that no longer reflect today's political and economic realities. And then for some reason they have this weird gray text box. Is this only on my version here, or does everyone see this when they load this page? I don't know. Just seems like weird design, but anyway, this once-in-a-generation opportunity serves as a moment to mend eroded trust and demonstrate that international cooperation can effectively achieve agreed goals and tackle emerging threats and opportunities. And then they go on to say, in September, world leaders will convene at the United Nations to adopt the Pact for the Future, which will include a global digital compact and a declaration on future generations as annexes. All right. And there's explainer video and what have you towards the Pact for the Future. There's lots of information here that you can go to. But you can also go to this Pact for the Future revisions page, which is in the title bar of this website, and it will show you the latest revision of this document. And at the point that I am recording this episode, the latest revision of this document is revision 4 from September 13th. By the time you're watching this, there might be a newer revision, or maybe even the final version might be ready. At any rate, please do explore that at your leisure. Here is exactly how you can access it on the UN page, but I will, of course, include the link as well in the show notes for this episode. But let's take a look. What is this Pact for the Future? What are they really trying to get at? Well, let's take a look at this revision 4 text. And if you want more on this, I will have more to say on this in the newsletter this weekend. More on that later. But right now, let's just take a look at some of this rhetoric and what it's saying and what it's not saying. I mean, starting off with Article 1 here. We, as the heads of state and government, representing the peoples of the world. Really? You're not representing me. I do not consent. Have gathered at United Nations headquarters to protect the needs and interests of present and future generations through the actions in this Pact for the Future. We are at a time of profound global transformation. We are confronted by rising catastrophic and existential risks, many caused by the choices that we make. We are making bad choices, so we are the problem. I hope they have some solution for that. Number 3, yet this is also a moment of hope, and opportunity. Global transformation is a chance for renewal and progress grounded in our common humanity. Indeed. These phrases are extremely resonant because they are embedded in a context. These are not English words that you can go and look up in the English dictionary and understand what is being meant by these sentences. These are phrases that have history and baggage and connections and context and associations that are important to understand. This is not English. This is globalese. So in my newsletter this weekend, I am going to be translating this document from whatever the globalese into plain English so that you understand what these phrases mean and how they're using them. So stay tuned for that. But anyway, let's just go through and take a look at some of the things that they're talking about in this Pact for the Future. Respect for international law, of course, as I recently pointed out in my most recent edition of Questions for Corbett on Is It Pyramids All the Way Up? Of course, the core tenet of international law is near and dear to the globalist heart. It may be the globalist heart because, of course, their ultimate dream, their goal, is to enact a world court with world jurisdiction so that they can bring the anarchy the anarchy between nations into line and a total top-down system of centralized authority. That is the quest for global government. That is why they talk so much about international law. And yes, it sounds so wonderful. Of course, we need to bring the do-batters? Are there just do-gooders? Are there do-batters? To justice. But who gets to decide who is the villain? And who gets to inflict that justice? Some piddly little details that may be important. Anyway, they talk about multilateral systems and its institutions with the United Nations and its charter at the center must be strengthened to keep pace with the changing world. Yes, because if things are working out so poorly and we're heading in the wrong direction and it's catastrophic and we're facing all these crises, the thing we need is more of these same multilateral institutions that have stewarded over this mess, right? It's exactly like a 9/11 or what have you. Oh my God, what a catastrophic failure of intelligence. What we need is to pump more money and give more powers over to these intelligence agencies so they can keep us even safer from the things that they didn't keep us safe from. Again, you understand the logic or lack thereof. A new beginning in multilateralism, Charter of the United Nations, again, sustainable development, that phrase, of course, which I obviously have talked about before and what it actually means. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and its Sustainable Development Goals, of course, have to be hyped, not only by the United Nations itself, tooting its own horn, and not only by the likes of Trudeau and Biden and all the other Western misleaders, but as I have demonstrated before, also 100% the pledge of fealty to the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Agenda have been said many, many times and put in official documents by Xi and Putin and the other BRICS saviors of this multilateral world order. Climate change, of course, they're going to cite the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, which, again, you can type those types of things into my search bar and you'll find much more information. They're going to talk about sustainable development and, more importantly, financing for development because, yes, we will take bold, ambitious, accelerated, just, and transformative actions. There's a lot of adjectives there. To implement the 2030 agenda. And how are they going to do that? Oh, they're going to eradicate poverty and end hunger. End hunger? Eliminate food insecurity? Yeah. Come on, UN. Make it all happen. And how are they going to do that? Oh, of course, they're going to promote equitable, resilient, inclusive, and sustainable agri-food systems. Translated from the Globalists, here's a little sneak preview of my newsletter. What does all that mean? Oh, it means such things as alternative protein sources, which is Globalists speak for eat the bugs and or the lab synthetic bio burgers or whatever they're going to try to shove down your throat, and the future of food, which I have, again, talked about in the past. They're going to close the SDG financing gap in developing countries. This is, you'll find a lot of rhetoric in this Pact for the Future about developing countries and bringing them on board, inclusivity, equity, blah, 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 because this has been a sticking point for globalist pacts in the past. For example, you will remember the Copenhagen Conference of the Parties back in 2009. That was being touted as this is going to be the beginning of global government. It's going to be wonderful. We're going to bring the whole world together under the yoke of the IPCC and the UNFCCC and the name of appeasing the weather gods, and we're going to have this global compact. And it fell apart. They didn't get what they wanted out of that conference precisely because the developing countries essentially just wanted a bigger share of the pie. Hey guys, there's all this money sloshing around. We're not getting enough of it. We're not on board with it. And it became a big sticking point. That's why you will always find in the WHO pandemic treaty and everything else, they always have this sop to the developing countries. Don't worry, guys. You're going to get your snoot into this trough as well. We're going to make sure you guys get some of this loot. And we can all rule over the neofeudal peasants. It's a global neofeudal plantation, and you guys, as the misleaders of your countries, you can have your share. So anyway, talking about multilateral trading systems, with the WTO at its core, of course. Yada, 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 sustainable development this, financing that, a new collective quantified goal for financing the climate transition, green transition takeover from a floor of $100 billion per year. That's the type of money we're talking about, and that's what the developing countries want to get, or at least the misleaders of the developing countries want to get. Restore, protect, conserve, sustainably use the environment. That sounds good. I wonder what it means. Who cares? Details, schmeetails. Reiterate our full respect for the sovereignty of all member states. Yeah. Sure. Anyway, you can go through this entire document. I will link it up, and you'll find all the talking points, the International Court of Justice and everything else. There are some doozies in here towards the end, which, again, I will get into in my newsletter. But I think going through here, you get the point. There's a lot of things that sound wonderful, ending poverty and ending hunger. I am for ending poverty, too, so I guess I'm for this Pact for the Future. But they all constantly frame it in the context of transforming global government, reinvigorating these multilateral systems, and in order to help us poor plebs to tackle the challenges that are facing us because of the choices that we have made. And again, there's a lot of rhetoric in here. You get the point, right? I mean, you do get the point. You understand what this is really about, not what they're saying, not the rhetoric surrounding this Pact for the Future. You understand what this really comes down to at base, right? Of course, it's about globalism. It is about that centralized trough of power and the top-down control of not just this nation or that nation, but the international system as a whole. And of course, bringing on all of the various players at this table in the elite superclass, bringing them all to the table and making sure, okay, guys, you're all going to get a piece of this, so we're going to cooperate together in order to make sure this happens, and we're going to push it through this time. And they may or they may not. But we understand where they're heading. And documents like this are just one more grain of sand in an entire beach filled with entire dunes and castles, sandcastles, and everything else that are all pointing in the same direction of global top-down control. Now, there are some interesting questions to ask about this entire process, this summit of the future, this pact for the future, and what it means. For example, what is a pact? I mean, what on earth is a pact? Have you ever heard of one of these international documents or things being called a pact? What is that? Is that a treaty? Well, not by name. And exactly as with the World Health Organization pandemic treaty process, of course, they tried to do linguistic backflips to avoid that word treaty because of the legal ramifications that come with it and getting things approved and consented by various parliaments and Congress and what have you. Let's just do an end run around that. No, this isn't a treaty. This is a pact. And look, I'm not a lawyer. I don't play one on TV. This is above my pay grade. I don't know. I don't have the legal document citing the legal ramifications of the use of the word pact, but I can tell you that in the United Nations Charter itself, there is no mention of anything. The word pact does not appear in that charter. It has no legal ramification, at least within the charter itself. They do talk about treaties, but there is no such thing as a pact in the United Nations Charter. So what does a pact mean? Is it binding? In what way? Is this just fluffy rhetoric? I think a lot of that is to be decided, but perhaps that misses the point, because as the old saying goes, when someone tells you who they are, believe them the first time. Well, this is the 88 millionth time that the globalists have told you who they are and what they are aiming at. They want to build up these systems of control. And of course, they keep saying, and with the United Nations and its charter at the center. Yes, obviously, this is a globalist plan for centralized authority. This should not be news to my regular listeners. It may be news to people out there who still believe in the United Nations. And yeah, maybe it does some bad things here or there, or it doesn't quite work the way it should, but the idea, the concept, the spirit of the United Nations is good, right? No, wrong. And we need to confront that attitude directly and forcefully, and that is exactly what I attempted to do in a presentation that I delivered for a live stream that was put on by the World Council for Health. Just earlier this week on Wednesday, there was a live stream about the UN's One World Government Agenda and the One Health Agenda. And I was one of the featured speakers there, and I was speaking on the concept of why we must oppose the United Nations. Because as much as those of us in the Corbett Report crowd may be aware of the United Nations and what it really represents, there are many, 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 many more indoctrinated people out there who have no idea and still believe the UN is something good. So, let's take a look at this presentation that I made for this live stream. Hello, James Corbett here, CorbettReport.com, coming to you from the land of the rising sun. And unfortunately, I'm not there live with you. This is a pre-recorded presentation because, as is so often the case, this live stream is taking place at a time when those of us in the land of the rising sun are currently sound asleep, and so am I. But I do want to take this moment to thank Shabnam and the people at the World Council for Health for inviting me to speak on this incredibly important subject of the UN's One World Government and One Health Agenda, which, as I hope you are starting to gather from all of the various presentations that you're hearing on this live stream, is an incredibly serious, incredibly important topic that poses incredibly large dangers for the future of humanity. And so you probably don't need to be told that the UN must be opposed, but here I am anyway to tell you why the UN must be opposed. And I think this is a subject on which I can speak with some degree of authority, at the very least because I have been speaking about it loudly, vociferously for the past, at the very least, 15 years, documentably so, going back at the very least to episode 87 of my Corbett Report podcast, released back in 2009 on The UN Doesn't Love You, which started with this long litany of abuses that have been perpetrated by the UN, its representatives, its peacekeepers, etc. throughout the years, and that was only up until 2009, and that litany of abuses that I detailed in that episode, for example, include the raping of children by UN peacekeepers, not once or twice in one or two isolated events, but over and over again in Haiti and in Liberia and in the Ivory Coast and southern Sudan. I also looked at the reports investigating the cover-up of UN peacekeepers involved in gun running and gold smuggling in the Congo. I looked at reports connecting the dots between a UN program to discourage breastfeeding in Botswana to a spate of infant deaths that took place in the wake of that advisement. I looked at the reports exposing UN complicity in forced sterilization of rural women in Peru. I looked at reports detailing how polio vaccines delivered as part of a UNICEF program in Nigeria, happened to be contaminated somehow or other with sterilizing agents. Wow, funny how that happens. Yes, as I say, this long litany of UN abuses, as necessarily incomplete as it is, as I say, that list was compiled 15 years ago. There's been another 15 years of abuses to add on that, plus the many, many, many other abuses that are not taken account of in that list. That should be damning enough in and of itself. But I also guarantee you that that list of abuses, no matter how long, no matter how complete you make it, will never convince someone who has been thoroughly indoctrinated by the UN and its propaganda organs that the UN is a wonderful institution, that the UN should be opposed. Because, again, I can speak with some authority on the subject because I was indoctrinated in the Canadian indoctrination system where the UN is mother's milk. It's wonderful. Not breast milk, obviously, if you're in Botswana, but it's wonderful. It's healthy. It's nourishing. We need the UN. Yes, there are bad apples. Yes, there are isolated events here and there where someone dressed in a UN uniform may have done something untoward, but that isn't what the UN is. Yes, every organization has its bad apples, but fundamentally, the UN is a force for good. It's a force for world peace. It means good. But I am here to say it does not mean good. The UN is not fundamentally good. No, it is an institution that has been conceived in iniquity and born in sin. It is rotten to its core. When we look at that list of abuses and failures of the UN, what we are looking at is not a list of failures. We are looking at the institution functioning as intended, as a cesspool of corruption, greed, lasciviousness, precisely because that is what this represents in the eye of the beholder, in this case, the people who first conceived of this idea. So let's talk about that. Conceived in iniquity. What do I mean by that? Well, specifically, I mean that we can trace, obviously, the origins of the United Nations back to its progenitor organization, the League of Nations, which was born from that Wilsonian idea of a new world order to rise from the ashes of the World War I conspiracy, and the idea of this global parliamentary body that was going to put an end to war and conflict and bring peace and harmony to, okay, well, that didn't work so well. Let's try it again, but this time with more teeth. And that is exactly what happened. So the idea, this wonderful idea of this noble global governmental institution, was taken up by FDR's Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, who began in 1939 the creation of a series of vehicles and advisory committees and divisions and other such internal departments and creation of committees in the State Department at the White House, committed to furthering this idea of global government, starting in 1939 with the creation of the Advisory Committee on Problems of Foreign Relations, which drafted a plan for a global government complete with an executive council and a General Assembly. That planning continued throughout World War II. As I say, there were a number of committees and organizations formed, like the Division of Special Research, which Hull formed in 1941 to pursue a future world order involving a World Assembly. And yes, the smoke was still clearing over Pearl Harbor when in February of 1942, literally just weeks after the U.S. had actually entered into World War II, there was Hull again, setting up an advisory committee on post-war foreign policy. Yes, February 42, literally weeks into the U.S. entry into World War II. They're already licking their chops, thinking about how best to carve up the world for their interests in the wake of the slaughter that was to come. And Yes, that advisory committee that Hull set up in 42 included not just government officials, but the president of the Council on Foreign Relations and the executive editor of the CFR's magazine, Foreign Affairs, and others who definitely wanted a seat at that table for the post-war order. And it is from those planning sessions that we got the seed, the kernel, that eventually sprouted into the United Nations after it was watered with the blood of millions of men, women, and children. This is the seed of the UN, a plan for global government and for the furtherance of the protection of the very interests that had just embroiled the entire war in a bloodshed, a wanton slaughter that had never been seen before in human history. But this time, don't worry guys, they're coming with an offer to save the world from their own future machinations and their own future bloodshed at the expense of your individual sovereignty. Who wouldn't take that deal? Well, after years of unimaginable slaughter, a lot of people were willing to accept that bargain, and that is why suddenly in the post-World War II world we have the flowering of the entire Pax Americana, which is no Pax at all, and all of the institutions attendant thereon, not only the United Nations itself, with the General Assembly and the Security Council, but the World Health Organization and the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, the Bretton Woods system for the International Monetary Order, all set up in the ashes of World War II. And the intention of this group and these organizations from the very start was the furtherance of the aim of the globalists and their beloved New World Order for documentably the past century, the sublimation of all sovereignty in the hands of an unelected, unaccountable World Assembly with a world court and a World Health Institution capable of delivering world health mandates, a world climate change panel that eventually resulted from the World Environmental Program that would monopolize the planet's resources and then deign to ration them out to the neofeudal peasants working the neofeudal plantation on the pretense that those peasants, trying to eke out a subsistence living, just trying to put food on their family's table, are themselves destroying the planet and angering the weather gods. No. We must lord over the riches of this planet, and we will give you such as we see fit. But we don't want to upset the earth too much, so we better put it all in our hands. Don't worry about us flying around the world on our private jets, having all of these shindigs. No. You are responsible for the weather gods being angry. You. Another aspect of this, the World Bank, that imposes a world tax on world citizens to control the world monetary supply. The building blocks have been set up, and yes, it is a long and slow and bureaucratic process that thankfully has been slowed by the public eventually waking up from their post-World War II slumber and trying to put the brakes on this incumbent world government. But it is still happening, and moves towards global taxation authority are still taking place to this day. A global government by any other name. Yes, the UN is the dream of complete and total control of the entire planet, its resources, and its people, including you, in the hands of an unaccountable body. So, yes, conceived in iniquity and born in sin. I will just add parenthetically, I'm sure this isn't an important detail, but those wonderful philanthropic Rockefeller brothers, sarcasm, obviously, if you don't know about the Rockefellers and what they've documentably been involved with, I would suggest typing Rockefeller into my search bar and, for example, watching the How and Why Big Oil Conquered the World documentary, but sidebar over. These wonderful philanthropic Rockefeller brothers, they decided to donate the land upon which the United Nations headquarters would be built there in New York. How wonderful. And what did that land used to be? Oh, yes, an abattoir, a slaughterhouse where animals were sacrificed at the realm of commerce. Well, now it's the United Nations, but again, trivial detail, I'm sure that doesn't matter much. Now, as I say, the propaganda for the UN that has been beat into the public consciousness over the course of the past 80 plus years is incredibly effective because it always comes wrapped in the most beautiful sounding language. Yes, the UN Sustainable Development Goals sound so beautiful when you read about these goals and ending poverty and hunger and lifting people up and all of these. Yes, let's protect the environment. Yes, they all sound beautiful until you read the fine print. Take, for example, SDG Goal 16. Promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development. Provide access to justice for all and build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. Who couldn't love that? It's wonderful. It makes the heart sing. But what does it actually mean? Yes, wonderful, beautiful sounding words, whatever. I'm for all of that blab, blab, blab. But what does it mean? What do you mean by that? Well, let's actually read some of these goals and drill down on them. So, for example, not only Goal 16 or any of the other goals, but they have subheadings that break these down into manageable tasks and goals that are being set. For example, 16.9, which is the target that says that by 2030, provide legal identity for all, including birth registration. Yes, that's right. You see, your legal identity is not just something that you have access to. No, it is a human right. You have the right to be identified and identifiable by any government authority, your own national government or international bodies. So you have the right to an identity, which means, what does that mean? Well, it means you have the obligation to accept the birth registration and identity documents that are provided to you by your national governing authority under the purview of the UN, of course. And, you know, back in the day, I suppose that might have meant maybe taking a handprint and filling out some paperwork. But paperwork and handprint? Come on, this is the 21st century. Yeah, now we can scan your iris. We can take your digital fingerprint. We can get all of the biometric details encoded into a chip that we'll put on some, well, I don't know, physical things that you're carrying around. I know. How about a digital ID? It'll all be digital. It'll all be in the cloud, and you'll have access to it at any time with your fingerprint. It'll be wonderful. Yes, this is the beauty bestowed upon you by the loving United Nations. Thank you, United Nations. Now I'm content in being a tax cattle, suitably tagged and numbered for the ease of identification of the UN and its bureaucrats. Wonderful. Or take, for example, UNESCO. Yes, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. How could you possibly stand opposed to education and science and culture, you fiend? Well, how about if you have two brain cells to rub together so you can actually read their founding document? That's right. Do you know who wrote the founding document of UNESCO? The first executive director of UNESCO. Who was that? Julian Huxley. Why does that? Oh, yes, the brother of Aldous Huxley, Brave New World, who also talked about the ultimate revolution in which people would be made through scientific devices to actually enjoy their servitude. Well, that Julian Huxley, former president of the British Eugenics Society, wrote the founding document of UNESCO, UNESCO, Its Purpose and Philosophy, in which he said, quote, "At the moment, it is probable that the indirect effect of civilization is dysgenic instead of eugenic. And in any case, it seems likely that the dead weight of genetic stupidity, physical weakness, mental instability, and disease proneness, which already exist in the human species, will prove too great a burden for real progress to be achieved. Thus, even though it is quite true that any radical eugenic policy will, for many years, be politically and psychologically impossible, it will be important for UNESCO to see that the eugenic problem is examined with the greatest care, and that the public mind is informed of the issues at stake, so that much that now is unthinkable may at least become thinkable." Oh yes, eugenics, dysgenics. We've got to take that out of the realm of the unthinkable towards the thinkable so that we can make it possible. Or how about take the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that, again, soul-stirring document from our overlords at the United Nations, first drafted by avowed eugenicist and technocrat H.G. Wells, which, again, sounds so wonderful upon first glance. The inherent dignity and the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family, and free speech, life, liberty, security of the person. Wonderful words to frame a document around until you get to 29.3, Article 29, subsection 3, in which, by the way, these rights and freedoms may in no case be exercised contrary to the purposes and principles of the United Nations. Oh, that's right. Your dissent against the UN will not be tolerated. You do not have the right to go against the United Nations. Don't you even dare think about that, tax cattle. This is the world of the unelected, unaccountable, would-be world government that is represented by the United Nations. And thankfully, as I have said and alluded to, most of the teeth of this world government has hitherto been a pipe dream of the globalists. But with the monstrosities like the Death Pact for the future, that reality is closer than ever to becoming realized. So, if World War I gave us the League of Nations, and World War II gave us the UN, what will the contrived World War III of this same gaggle of committed globalist psychopaths unleash upon the world? Let's not find out. If we value freedom, if we value medical sovereignty, political sovereignty, monetary sovereignty, freedom of speech, freedom of thought, freedom of action, the sovereign right to live our lives as free human beings in voluntary cooperation with other sovereign, free individuals, then the UN must be opposed with all of our might. There is no half measure here. No wishy-washy attempt at reform or tweaking this or that or working around the edges will do. No half-hearted political reservation against an IHR amendment here or an IPCC declaration there will truly drive the stake through this vampire's heart. No. Only total, unequivocal withdrawal from the UN will do. You may laugh. That is a pipe dream. It's unthinkable that anyone would take that up as a political platform and see it through to its completion. But, to paraphrase Huxley, well, we must work so that the unthinkable becomes at least thinkable. United Nations delenda est. I am James Corbett of CorbettReport.com. Thank you for your time and attention. Yes, that is the bitter soil from which this corrupted seed of the Pact for the future springs, nourished by the black sunshine of an authoritarian technocratic eugenicist mindset and the acid rain of top-down centralized political structures. And yes, as I say, I think nothing less than the destruction of the United Nations will do. Not obviously in some violent act that will only garner sympathy for these globalist stooges. No. In the complete withdrawal of all of our participation from the United Nations, and of course there are political ways that can be affected, and more importantly, I think it has to be affected in our own hearts, in our own minds, because, as I say, so many authoritarian statists have been thoroughly indoctrinated from the moment of their birth at the very least, the idea of the United Nations is something beautiful and something we should be striving toward rather than running away from. So yes, I think complete withdrawal of the United Nations should not only be thinkable, but should be an urgent political priority, because in a way that's the umbrella to all of these, or so many of these problems, the World Health Organization and others. Yes, we should withdraw from the World Health Organization, but how about, why stop there? Why not the United Nations altogether? However, having said that, I mean, is that going to be enough? There's there's more to deal with than simply the United Nations or simply the Pact for the Future. One example of that we can expand the scope of what we're dealing with is to look, again, remember that what is the Summit of the Future explainer page, where they helpfully explain that the Pact for the Future will include a global digital compact and a declaration on future generations as annexes to this document, and that's not necessarily a trivial thing. So if you want more information about that, I would suggest you go to the Brownstone Institute at brownstone.org for an informative article on 3 new pacts to be approved at the UN Summit, where they talk not only about the Pact for the Future, but those other global digital compact and the future generations compact. So there's more to explore on that side. And of course, it's not just this summit for the Summit of the Future. It is the UN General Assembly and what will be taking place there and what will be adopted. For example, the foreboding UN Convention on Cybercrime, again from the Brownstone Institute. The link will be in the show notes if you'd like to read through this informative article. But long story short, yes, this Convention on Cybercrime, again, sounds so wonderful. Yes, we do want to cut down on cybercrime and child sex trafficking and all these horrible things that everyone's against. So what we need to do is turn it over to the UN. And, oh, by the way, eliminate encryption, make journalism, or at least allow governments to essentially pursue journalists in the digital realm, to make it so that compel developers to put backdoors into their software, etc. This is a proposed convention that is so egregious and that is apparently about to be rubber stamped that even mainline, completely mainstream organizations are saying, you cannot do this. This will ultimately criminalize journalism. This will compel various developers to put things in their own software that will completely destroy it. So this is a pretty big deal as well. And it's, unfortunately, not just the UN. If only this were a question of simply withdrawing from the UN and done, everything's good. But no, of course it isn't. Here's a startling and weird example of where how this agenda can manifest in any form, in any shape, in any locality, for any reason or any express reason. For example, this information from LifeSite News: Canadian pandemic bill would regulate meat production and develop contact tracing, I think they mean to say. And, of course, we can understand contact tracing in the context of a bill for pandemic preparedness, this Bill C-293 that is currently snaking its way through the Canadian Senate. At least we understand the types of arguments that were employed in the scamdemic. Well, we have to know who you've been in contact with, so we need to have access to your location and everyone you've met and all of that. At least we understand the logic they are trying to employ there. But how about regulating meat production? What on earth does that have to do? Oh, yes. Again, don't take my word for it or LifeSite News' word for it. Go and actually read Bill C-293, which is linked up here in this article. And you can read the actual language of the bill that talks about not only regulating commercial activities that can contribute to pandemic risk, including industrial agriculture. So yes, yet again, another vector for the attack on food and food systems that is part of this ushering in of the future of food and alternative protein sources and all the other rhetoric that they're using. But yes, they want to promote commercial activities that can help reduce pandemic risk. So including activities that involve high-risk species, production of alternative proteins, of course, again, the Eat the Bugs agenda, coming up in this bill that's supposedly about pandemic preparedness. And this isn't even part of the World Health Organization of the United Nations, at least not in its details and particulars. No, this is a bill that's been forwarded by a Liberal Party backbencher in the Canadian Parliament for the Canadian government to rubber stamp and to enact in Canadian law. And you better believe there's similar bills that are being forwarded all around the world in all sorts of different national legislatures. And the citizens of any one country probably isn't going to know about what some other country on the other side of the world is doing that happens to be in absolute lockstep with this. But this is the vision. Yes, you can defeat the pandemic treaty, the WHO pandemic treaty. Well, it hasn't been defeated. They've just shunted it off into committee and talking shops, and they're going to come back at it. But even if it never gets passed in any form whatsoever, well, every national legislature is just going to take it up and start passing these bills individually. And ain't nothing you can do about that because it's just all part of the national system of governance. So what are you going to do? So this is not just about the United Nations. Here's another example, one that's near and dear to my heart, or my home at any rate, here in Japan. Japan prepares 8th round of COVID vaccinations with self-amplifying mRNA. That's right, yes, it's time to roll up your sleeve for the annual, semi-annual jab booster update. And this time, boy, do they have an update for you. Yes, self-amplifying mRNA vaccines, aka replicon vaccines, have been already approved and are due to be included in this upcoming vaccination drive here in Japan next month. Excuse me, next month. I can barely say it without tripping over myself because the enormity of what is happening. And so few people seem to even understand that this is happening. But here we go. Self-amplifying mRNA. What can go wrong? If you don't know about self-amplifying mRNA vaccines and what they purport to do and what their dangers may or may not be, I would humbly suggest you check out my recent editorial on Replicon, Big Pharma Preps the Next Bioweapon, which will explain what this is and what is taking place. But I hope stories like this, I could name 8 million separate news stories that are going through the news wires today that are all aspects and pieces of this overwhelming puzzle that paints the picture of this globalist New World Order. Some of which, of course, has to do with the United Nations, some of which doesn't. Some of which will be directly talked about in the Pact for the Future, some of which won't. And all of these pieces link together because they are all united by that shared ideology of globalism and the idea, the quest for top-down centralized political authority. That is the guiding, shining beacon that all of these various players from on all of these different sides of whatever phony political aisle, etc., can all unite on and will constantly be pushing in a certain direction. And from that perspective, looking at broadening this out, it's not just about the UN, it's about this incredible broad picture. You can withdraw from the UN, but that won't end globalism. That seems like a disheartening message. That, oh my God, this is such an overwhelming agenda. How can we possibly put the brakes on this? How can we possibly derail it? But actually, I think there is some hardening idea to take out of this. And that's that the incredible progress that has been made towards the building of this multilateral system that functions in these international organizations and is being pushed in all of these national legislatures and local city councils and everywhere else actually doesn't speak to the fact that these globalists and misleaders and technocrats and super gophers are such galaxy brain wizards and incredibly smart and have everything planned down and they can do anything they want. No, it speaks to the opposite. No, these are bumbling idiots most of the time who can barely tie their own shoelaces, but they understand the value of working together. They understand the value of planning for a long-term vision and planning the steps that are needed to reach that vision. And they understand the value of continuing to press, making sure that every problem will be framed in the narrative that they want. Oh, the problem is we don't have enough centralized authority and control. So the solution, no matter what the problem is, no matter whether that problem is completely real, completely fictitious, something in between, generated artificially, happening naturally, whatever it is, the answer will always be the answer that they want. Oh, we need more control. We need more centralization. We need more authority. We need to tell you how to live your life, neofeudal slave. And so, not just year after year, not just decade after decade, but generation after generation, they can work towards a goal. And even if they are bumbling idiots who can barely tie their shoelaces, they will get closer to that goal because they do not stop. One way of understanding this is to understand it not only through, yes, surely an international organization like the UN, the IMF, the World Bank, the World Health Organization, these international organizations, which obviously are institutions that have been cemented in international law and have been functioning for the better part of a century at this point. Yes, that's an example of this the way that these structures and institutions can be set up for long-term goals and development. Not only in, of course, national legislatures and governments that continue to press towards these, but through something like the Rockefeller Foundation, of course, set up under John D. Rockefeller Sr., the progenitor of the Rockefeller dynasty, with the immense, incredible capital that he accrued in monopolizing the world's wealth for the benefit of him and his family and his fellow travelers. But then parlaying that out into this philanthropic institution, which my listeners will definitely know the history of, and the way that it has truly shaped and transformed global society. It has changed the face of the planet in the 20th century demonstrably through the eugenics funding, the green revolution, the gene revolution, the population counts, all of these things that the Rockefellers have had their snoots in. And at this point, is the Rockefeller Foundation really even about the Rockefeller family? Has it ever been? It's always about the board of directors and the various people who have inputs in that. And yes, the Rockefellers have had control over the organization at various points, and especially when it was being headed by actual Rockefellers. But at this point, it is just this generational institution that is constantly working towards a goal. Year after year, decade after decade, generation after generation. It's an incredible thing to behold. But it actually, doesn't that give us some clue as to the way that we could be approaching a solution to the problems that are being posed by these globalists? Yes, they know how to work together. They know how to formulate a plan and find a way to step-by-step work towards a goal, and then they implement it. And if it doesn't work, they just keep going and keep going and keep going and keep going and inching their way towards their goal. And it may take years, it may take decades, it may take generations, but they will reach their goal as long as we continue to just fight amongst ourselves and concentrate on things of no importance whatsoever. So if we want to counteract this globalist agenda and mindset, we better be able to articulate our own goals, our own agenda, our own mindset. What is the ideology that guides us? And how does that differ from the way that we're being led along by the nose through these machinations that take place on the international scale? And if we had a vision and could articulate what our goals are for 2030 and beyond, and have a plan, an action plan of steps that we can take to reach those goals, at the very least, again, we could be bumbling idiots who can't tie our shoelaces, but if we stick to it and continue to press and frame every problem to our solution, you know what? You know what would make this problem better? Freedom, human autonomy, sovereignty. Me claiming I am an individual sovereign with my own rights. That's what will fix this problem of terrorism or whatever globaloni problem that they invent. We can form it with our solutions, right? And I am not speaking for you or anyone else. Obviously, if we are confronting and rebuking this top-down centralized ideology and mindset where everything has to be the plans of an oligarchical conspiring few to foist their will upon the many, of course, if we create an alternative structure or a counter structure that is simply that, but no, it's for our goals, it is the same thing. Ultimately, yes, no, we need to impose top-down our views, and by our, I mean me and my friends, and I'll tell you what you guys need to think. No, obviously not. We need to reclaim our individual sovereignty and our right to freely associate or disassociate from anyone we want based on our principles and our ideals, what we are working towards individually, and what we can come together to cooperate on. And that is our choice. So we have to find decentralized, grassroots, bottom-up ways to combat this centralized, top-down system of control that is being imposed upon us. So, what does that mean? What is the actual brass tacks of that? Well, I ask you and myself and everyone else who's participating in this digital conversation today, do you have a plan for do you have a 2030 agenda? Not the globalist 2030 agenda. For you, at the very, very, very least, for you and your family, let alone you and your wider community, let alone what you would like to see taking place broadly on the planet. Well, let's just concentrate on that inner ring first. Do you have an actual vision of what you want by the year, whatever arbitrary date you want to set? Let's not set 2030 because that's their year. Let's set 2029 or 2031 or whatever it is. And then what actions can you take to reach that goal? Do you have such a vision? Do you have a plan articulated? And if not, why not? Shouldn't that be an incredibly important thing that we are doing, again, for ourselves, that we can then come together with like-minded people to achieve those goals? Shouldn't that be the answer to this problem? Yes, withdraw from the UN. Yes, withdraw from the WHO, all these other international multilateral systems. And yes, ultimately, let's start withdrawing from the national structures, which are imposing things like Bill C-293 in Canada and trying to steward over industrial agriculture and everything else in the name of protecting us from whatever, the next scamdemic or the angry weather gods or whatever excuse they use next week. So yes, we should be doing all of that, but how about creating a vision and working towards that vision? So if you want a concrete example of people who are doing that and attempting to do that at any rate, I would once again direct you in the direction of my recent Solutions Watch on Our Summit for Our Future, talking about the People's Reset Summit that will be taking place in Bath in the UK later this month. And I certainly hope there will be some Corbett Report members in attendance there. And if so, I would very much like to hear your report about that summit and what it spurs and the ideas that it gives rise to and how those are implemented in your life. But that's the point. It's not like there is some centralized, everyone must go to Bath in the UK for the People's Reset, or everyone must follow this person and do what they say. No, that is exactly what we are working against. But we do need to be able to articulate a vision and work towards it. So that will be something that I will be concentrating on in the future on Solutions Watch. I hope you will be along with me for that. And as I say, speaking of this pact for the future and the immediate threat on the table that is coming as I record this next week in the United Nations, well, I think we should understand this agenda and what they really mean by their rhetoric so that we can, at the very least, even if you know all of this, all old news to you, you need to be able to articulate this to the not dozens, not hundreds, not thousands, not millions, but the billions of people on the planet who swallow this rhetoric wholesale, or who read a line about inclusivity and diversity and whatever else, whatever buzzword, and take it at its face value, the literal dictionary definition, without understanding what those words mean and why we should be opposed to them. If you want help articulating that, as I say, I'm working on an editorial for this weekend where I will be translating the Pact for the Future from globalese into plain English. So I will commend that to your attention. As always, of course, my newsletter is 100% totally, completely available, 100% for free. You don't need to give me your money or email address or anything else. It will be at corbettreport.substack.com. Having said that, if you would like to support the work, you can, of course, sign up to become a member at corbettreport.com and access the newsletter on corbettreport.com. Having said that, I would appreciate that support. There are lots of links in the show notes for today's episode that will expand out on the various things that I've talked about today and document them for yourself and your own edification and the edification of your normie friends and other people who need to know this information. So I hope that will be of some use for you. But I think we're going to end today's exploration there. I am James Corbett of CorbettReport.com, looking forward to articulating that vision for the future and helping flesh out some articulation of that vision in the near future.